If there's a crisis situation in this country, what are the areas that criminals are going to most likely target? Look, I'm not an expert. All I can do is provide an opinion based on my experience and based on what I've read and common sense, really. Rockstar Redondo was on DJ Grooveline's video talking about she wasn't convinced there was going to be an economic collapse or any type of Mad Max scenario. For one, I don't know. I don't think there's going to be a Mad Max scenario, but as far as the economic collapse, well, when you have a country that goes from being the richest superpower in the world with the highest standard of living to a country where about half of its population is poor or near poor, and about 46 million out of the 300 million people in the country are living on food stamps. I think that's a sign of some serious economic trauma. She talked about it was a bad idea to bug out to the rural areas, and I agree that in general you should be where you're at should be where you should be prepared to stay. You should be working on the community where you're at right now. Generally speaking, as far as rural areas, she was citing Fernando, this guy who survived the Argentina collapse. He has a blog and he talks about it a lot, and he survived it. He has some practical experience, and that's really valuable. However, you have to look at each country differently because the cultures and environments are very different. It's just because certain things happened in Argentina during their collapse doesn't mean that it's going to repeat here in the U.S. For one thing, he was talking about how if you're in a rural area, it's a disadvantage because you have to pay more for commuting to cities for jobs, and you have to spend more time commuting. Gas prices become more of an issue, which is true. He talked about less jobs, but here's the deal. In the U.S., the economy is a little bit different. The cities have been pretty much gutted. The infrastructure has been decimated. And a lot of these jobs are really in the suburban area, so the commute time isn't really that extreme. Moreover, as far as isolation, he talks about how if you're in a rural area, in a shit-is-a-fan scenario, you'll be less likely to deal with opportunistic criminals, more likely to deal with the criminals who are well-planned and organized. I'm not really sure, because you have to understand, in Argentina, the gun laws are very different from the laws here in the U.S. The culture in the rural Argentina is very different from the rural culture in the U.S. You have to understand a lot of criminals were able to isolate and target families and rape and torture and kill people in Argentina. I'm not saying that won't happen here, but you have to understand that we're in a country where we probably have more guns than people. And you compare that to a place like Argentina where you have to provide a justifiable reason to have a firearm. I mean, the gun control is a lot more extreme over there. And, people often try to cite rural people in Mexico and other down in South America, some rural areas in South America and Mexico as examples of what could happen if you're isolated. The thing is, those tend to be anti-gun countries where the average rural person doesn't really have a lot of firepower. The neighbors aren't likely to have a lot of firepower. In the U.S., I'm not sure it's going to be a good idea in a collapse scenario to go down to rural Tennessee or rural Arkansas or rural Texas or rural Oklahoma or rural Nebraska and try to start some trouble down there, because when you go into these small towns, these rural areas, they see you and hear you a mile away. Okay, they know the area a lot better than you do. So if you go down there with a professional team, they're going to notice these strangers looking around. In the collapse scenario, they might not welcome that. A lot of these places might shut down their entire city, their entire towns and areas altogether. So it may not be such a good opportunity to do that. As far as the U.S., he talked about how there's more pressure if you're in the city, if you're committing crimes, to hurry up and get out. That may be true in Argentina, but in the U.S., that's not really true. In the U.S., people in rural areas are more likely to stick together. They're more likely to give a damn what's going on across the street or down the road. And the reason why I say that is because I lived in a rural area here in the U.S. and I lived in an urban area in the U.S. I'm telling you, the rural people, they don't just let things pass. Even if they don't like their neighbor, you think they're just going to let you do whatever you want to their neighbor. Generally speaking, the type of rural people I come across, no, they're not going to let you do that. As far as pressure, there's actually more pressure in rural areas and even in a lot of suburban areas, and even in some cities. It depends on the community. It's all about the community. Because if people actually give a damn, there's going to be a lot more pressure. People are more likely to respond. Whereas in cities, there's people who've had their homes invaded, they've been robbed, beaten, killed, raped. Police don't show up for hours later. So being in the city doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be more pressure for the bad guys to hurry up and do whatever they're going to do. So I actually think if people want to do some dirt, generally the cities and the suburbs are going to be better areas for that. I mean, there's been situations in Boston and New York where people have been hit by cars, attacked, and nobody's done anything. You know, in New England, somebody was hit by a car. I saw a video of a guy hit by a car. People just walked by. People did nothing. New York, a man went to a woman's rescue when she was being mugged. He was stabbed. He laid on the concrete, laid on the sidewalk, and people walked by. He bled to death. He was out there for hours. He just bled to death right in New York City. So the idea that, oh, if you're in a country area, you're going to be isolated and people aren't going to, it's going to be easier for organized criminals to actually go after you and have more time to do what they want to do. I don't know if that's true. I'm not saying it is or it isn't. I'm just saying based on what I'm seeing here in the U.S., I'm not really sure that's true. Logically, I think you will be better off in a rural area simply because if you think like a criminal, well, one, if you're looking to rape somebody or hurt somebody with the least amount of resistance, if you look at the crime statistics in normal times, maybe things will be different in a shit hits a fair scenario. If you look at the crime statistics now, most of those type of killings and killings in general tend to happen in urban areas. Whereas rural areas, they don't really have a lot of that going on. There's clear proof that criminals have had plenty of time to do whatever they want to do in urban areas, even right now. So as far as economic crime, people trying to steal stuff, it's more logical to go to suburban areas. You know, suburban areas, simply because, I mean, think about it. In a suburban area, you have a greater population density, more population density than you would in a country area. And you also have more money and more resources in a lot of these suburban areas. They have more of the things that the criminals actually want. Why would you go out in the middle of the country where nobody knows you and you're going to attract attention just by being a stranger and hit one place, then try to hit another place? You're probably going to run into some resistance. And how are you going to stake out a place in a rural area for a couple of days to actually hit without any of the neighbors, anybody catching on to you? That doesn't really work very well. Suburban areas, you have more houses within a limited area, so you get more game, and there's actually less risk unless they're organized. So that's another thing to actually consider. Another thing people mention is the Great Depression. People talk about how, you know, people flocked to the cities in the Great Depression. I wasn't there. I don't know. Again, this is all speculation based on some facts I've observed. But in case you haven't noticed, the U.S. cities aren't the same as they were in the 1930s. Okay, deindustrialization. That was before we really actually heavily industrialized a lot of our cities. But we've been very much deindustrialized. I've shown how a lot of these cities, or at least in Flint, how they've been, a lot of these factories and resources have been abandoned, you know, so, and plus you have a different cultural element. There's a lot more crime, there's a lot more hostility, there's much more dangerous areas in the urban areas than they were, now than they were in the 1930s. Something to also think about. Another thing, yes, people say that there's more resources in the city. That's absolutely correct. There's more resources in the city. Problem is, there's a lot more people in the city. I mean, if the city has 10 times as much resources than a small town, but they have 20 times as many people, then obviously the ratio is going to be out of whack. They're actually going to have less resources per person. So, yes, they have more resources, but they also have a lot more people draining those resources. Yeah, in the rural areas, you have a lot less resources, but you have a lot less people. So it's all about the ratios and things like that. So those are some things that enter my mind. You guys tell me what you think about this. Again, I'm not an expert. I'm just giving you my opinion. I think that when you look at all the variables, or the variables I'm looking at, suburban areas will probably be a more attractive target. However, with that said, that doesn't mean that you're going to be a victim in the suburban area. It's all about community. It's all about your relationships with the people around you, your neighbors. You know, it doesn't matter where you're at. If you don't have a good relationship or good rapport with your neighbors, you're going to be dealing with some problems, and you really will be isolated. You can be isolated in the city, where there's a million people, and you can be isolated in the suburb, and you can be isolated in a rural area. So that's my take on things. As far as the whole fantasy that whole shit is a fantasy that Redondo was commenting on, DJ Groupline asked me about this before. This fantasy, they claim that there's some preppers who have this fantasy that once the shit is the fan, people are going to be, women are going to be flocking to them because they have resources. I've never heard of this, ever. I don't know why he keeps bringing it up. I've never, ever heard of any preppers talking about, oh, yeah, when the shit is a fan, women are going to be all over me. I haven't heard of this. They claim they heard of it, but I haven't heard of it at all. You know, I mean, come on, you know, if you want horny women, there's horny women around right now. You don't have to wait till the shit hits the fan to get on that. But anyway, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And don't forget, the future belongs to those who prepare for it today. Bye.